I had no other symptoms. I had nothing that would have ever caused me to think I was pregnant. They ended up doing an ultrasound and come to find out I was 6 months pregnant. So I was 24 weeks pregnant. And at that time, they had to basically tell my fiance at the time that, we have one to save her, we have to deliver the baby. So I was on birth control and had always been on birth control, and I was not having any pregnancy symptoms. I was still getting my period every month. So it all happened on a Wednesday night. I had gone to work that day and I knew I felt off. I just thought I had a really bad migraine, which I never really had in general prior to. And being at work, I just kind of, as the day progressed, I just felt worse and worse. And I went home and I had lived with my fiance at the time, Josh, who's now my husband. But so I went home and we were making dinner, and we actually were making chili that night. And we were getting ready to sit down for dinner. And I just told him, I was like, I don't feel good. I just feel off and something just doesn't feel right. And he was like, oh, you probably just have a headache. So I went up to bed. And I don't remember this part, but apparently I had thrown up in our toilet and not flushed it, which was like very not like me. So when my husband came up to bed, maybe I think he said like an hour later, he had noticed that, and he said he had tried to wake me up and say like, "Are you okay? Like, I noticed you threw up and you didn't flush it or anything." And from his story, because I don't remember this, he had said I had like lately woken up and said, yeah, my stomach hurts. And he was like, okay. He had gotten into bed and he said it was probably about maybe 15, 20 minutes of being in bed with me. Then he felt the bed like violently shaking. And he, at that time, had thought that I had just thrown up and I was choking on it. And so he, thankfully, being in the Army and having some medical training, knew what to do in that stance, and thankfully it ended up being the same stance of what you would do when you're having a seizure. He had turned me on my side and opened my mouth and was holding my mouth open with his thumb in his hand, not realizing that I actually was having a seizure. So he had called 911, and from his telling me after the fact, he had said they were at our house about for 11 to 12 minutes trying to work on me, realizing I was unresponsive and just going into seizure after seizure. At that point, they had to make the call that they were going to take me to the ER. And so they had taken me in through the ER. At this time, we did not know I was pregnant. And so they took me in through the ER, and, I think I was 24 at the time, being unresponsive, having all these seizures. They kind of were like, what is and they asked him, like, does she do drugs? Does she drink? Like, all these things, trying to find some answer. And they asked him, they're like, well, is she pregnant? And he was like, no, I live with her, I would know if she is. And so then they started doing test after test, realizing then at that point I had a bunch of brain swelling as well, which was what was causing me to go into an unresponsive state. At the time I had gotten to the ER, my blood pressure was already 210 over 124, which is considered stroke levels. And so, they obviously were working very fast to try to figure out what was going on, being only 24 years old and being in this state. And finally, a doctor came in and said, you're saying she's not pregnant, but they were like, all of these symptoms are kind of lining up with what we would call pre-eclampsia. And then as you get into the seizures, eclampsia. And they said then that would make sense with the brain swelling, because that would be considered Press syndrome. And so then they were like, well, let's just do the test. They ended up doing an ultrasound and come to find out I was 6 months pregnant. So I was 24 weeks pregnant. And at that time, they had to basically tell my fiance at the time that, we have one to save her, we have to deliver the baby. So with my C-section, I obviously still was not responsive or in a responsive state. So I had to go under general anesthesia. And with that, my fiance at the time was not allowed in the room when you're under general anesthesia. So he kind of had to sit on the outside, kind of waiting to hear everything. I had to end up having a classical C-section because it was such an emergency. They couldn't take the time to do what you call like the bikini horizontal C-section. So a classical C-section is from the belly button and down. Luckily, I only on my skin, I was able to have a bikini cut, but on my uterus was a classical incision. And that's kind of when they're doing the C-section, that's the cut that matters the most, is because it's on your uterus, not on your skin. So I was fortunate in being able to have a bikini cut on my skin, but then on my uterus, I had to have a classical cut because it was such an emergency. So my daughter, Charlotte, who is our 24-weeker, who came out of this story, she was born at 15 and a half inches long, and she was about 1 pound, 6 ounces when she was born. So she literally fit in the palm of my hand and also the palm of my husband's hand. So she was very small. She was obviously put on a ventilator right away. All of the life-saving measures for a baby at that gestation. And she, what they call the bag method. So when they're born that little, they put them in a bag because they're trying to keep them warm and trying to mimic the womb as much as they can for the baby. So she was in a bag the first day while they were doing all the tests and running all the tests and getting her obviously to a point of where she would be what's considered stable for that gestation. So the C-section ended up going well. I was still not in a responsive state. I had a bunch of brain swelling still, and my body kind of was shutting down due to all of the seizures I had. That night, they had what they put counted, meaning from the time I was in EMS to the time at the hospital, I had 11 seizures. They think prior to that, I probably had at least 2 or 3 before EMS even started counting the seizures. So I was not in a responsive state still. I actually was still in an unresponsive state. So I went to the ICU. I was put on a ventilator myself because my body was so swollen and having so many bad reactions that they had to put me on a ventilator to basically get the help that I needed to make sure. So I was put in a medical induced coma on the ventilator. I was on the ventilator for 2 days. I woke up, she was born on the C-section, born on October 29th, and I did actually not know about her until November 1st. That was the first day that I kind of started coming aware of, that I wasn't at home, that something had happened. When they had told me I had a baby, my husband was there, and my mom, thankfully, and then some of the doctors and nurses, but I clearly was a deer in headlights, not realizing, or even I think I still kind of was a little loopy at that point, not understanding exactly everything going on. It took a couple hours to finally set in, I think, to realize I had a baby once my husband had showed me a picture of like, no, there is actually a baby. The baby is in the NICU, and thankfully the hospital we're at has a really great NICU. So she was only a couple floors away, but I was not able at that point to still go see her as I had not been able to get in a wheelchair yet or anything. So I actually, before this, had never known about preeclampsia or even eclampsia in that stance, or that was ever like something that could happen in a pregnancy. I've learned now that there is really not a lot of information out there about it or warnings that this can happen to you. Eclampsia is very rare, and looking back at it, my OB said I was one of those cases of, one, I didn't know I was pregnant, but 2, feeling completely fine and then going from basically 0 to 100. She's like, that is even more of a kind of a rare circumstance. She had said, even though had I known I was pregnant, it probably still would have happened. She was like, a lot of times with preeclampsia, you start getting some warning signs, and then you have those rare cases that it just is, you're perfectly fine, and then all of a sudden, it's just, you go into the seizures, the full eclampsia mode. So I finally got to see her on day 5, after the fact of when they were able to get me, I had to be able to get into a wheelchair, to be able to get down to the NICU. So thankfully, the medical team was great. The nurses were great. They were basically like, we will do anything to get you in a wheelchair, even if it's just for an hour to get down there to see her. Day 5 is when I kind of felt good enough and was able to like actually move my legs and move my body and get into a wheelchair. And so they took me down to the NICU. It definitely was overwhelming because it was like, obviously, I do know I was going to have a baby. So it was overwhelming, but I remember like at the point seeing her, like I knew I would do anything for her. Um, and just making sure she was okay and got what she needed and the care she needed. Um, it definitely was very overwhelming, but at the same time, it was like, I don't know the right word to use. Um, it was like, I knew she was there for a reason, kind of thing too. So it was, seeing her was really good. The part that was, I think, the hardest was I couldn't hold her yet.
Do you hear mommy's voice? Hi.
One, my body wasn't
Hi,
strong enough.
baby.
Two, she was still on so many machines and still so fragile. I didn't get to hold her till day 10.
Are you gonna say hi to everyone? Are you gonna say hi there, world? Say hi.
So it was definitely like interesting in a way, because it was like, obviously when you have your first baby, it's never what you imagine, being in a NICU or being having anything wrong with your baby or being born that early. So it definitely was obviously never in my books to go through that with my first pregnancy. So 4 years ago, when we had Charlotte at 24 weeks, her survival rate was about 22%. She was so fragile. So best way to explain it, but she kind of looked like a flightless bird, like no feathers, nothing, like was just all skin and bone basically. Um, but it was, that first month was very touch and go, but they were very reassuring. They would tell me all the time, like, she's making great progress, but you're always going to have those little steps back. She had, within the first month, a couple codes, and that was really scary in itself, just knowing that. But again, they always did everything possible for her. And I always kind of felt very reassured in that fact. I spent a lot of time at the NICU because I obviously wanted to be there with her. So in the NICU, like obviously in the very beginning when they're born a micropreemie, which is what Charlotte was considered. So anything under 28 weeks is considered a micropreemie. They want to mimic the womb as much as possible for these babies because they want them to feel like they're still in the womb, to be able to grow and thrive. So they're hooked up to a ton of machines. They are in what's called an incubator, which keeps their temperature. So the incubator keeps them warm, keeps them basically to where their body is not going to get cold and shut down. And within that incubator, then they put what's called like the little quilts or giraffe bedding over it. That is to keep it dark because they want these babies to remain in the dark to, again, mimic the womb. She was hooked up to a lot of machines. She was on a ventilator. She was on the pulse ox, blood pressure. She was on feeding tubes. So it was like, obviously, then the EKG, all of that stuff, because they continuously do those vitals because they want to make sure that through the whole day, night, that those vitals are consistent for the baby. So my recovery was pretty rough. Obviously, majority of it being because of how everything happened. The C-section, it was an emergency C-section. It didn't help that I wasn't able to get out of bed for a couple of days. So the C-section recovery was a little bit worse than what it normally would be because you couldn't get up and move around. I was still pretty much bed tied for a couple of days. And even after the ICU, I was moved to high-risk maternity postpartum for a couple more days just to be monitored with my blood pressure and everything. It took about almost 7 months for my blood pressure to go back to normal, or what's considered my new normal, I should say. So it took about 7 months for my blood pressure to finally regulate. I had to go through a lot of MRIs and CAT scans following just because of all the seizures and brain swelling I had. It took a little over a year for my brain swelling to fully go away. I was very lucky. I had great neurologists who, kept an eye on me, who were always monitoring me. And I had some different side effects, one being called what's demyelination. Also, that showed up in the MRIs, which come to find out really affects your memory. But also the demyelination showed, and within the MRI, it showed that I had what would be considered a mini stroke. And they said that was because of how high my blood pressure got, that I got to the stroke levels. So luckily it wasn't any worse than what it was. But after the fact, I had a lot of memory problems. For a couple months, I would just constantly repeat myself, and I would feel so bad because I tell something to someone, and then 5 minutes later, repeat myself again. Um, and then it was just a lot of doctor appointments, a lot of follow ups, a lot of just making sure things were slowly getting back to normal. Um, Thankfully, the brain swelling did fully go away. That was kind of a concern for a while, was if it would go away or if it would kind of plateau. If it plateaued, then we would have had to look at different options. But I was very thankful and I'm very lucky to have the recovery that I did. So Charlotte, our 24-weeker, who's now about to be 4 end of October, she is our Spitfire, crazy, sassy toddler. She, for a 24-weeker, is doing absolutely amazing. We were given a lot of different stats of, she's going to have some delay. She's going to have side effects. She might have cerebral palsy, just because she had those brain bleeds in the beginning. And we were given a lot thrown at us. And it was kind of like, we were like, okay, like we don't know where she'll be or how she'll do. And I can say today we're very, very fortunate. She did have delays, and she was delayed in some areas in the beginning, but we had her in all the therapies, the OT, the physical therapy. She saw neurology. We had a very great care team that worked with her. And if you look at her today, you probably would never know she's a 24-weeker. She, has some like more, I would say, immune system issues than anything. She has a lot of lung issues still, but that was kind of to be to expected with a 24-weeker who had BPD, who had, very undeveloped lungs. But we are very fortunate that they're treatable, and she still has a great care team who is always making sure she's doing well, she's thriving, she's growing to where she should be. My words of advice would be, obviously, I never thought I was going to be in that situation. And in the beginning, it is really hard to deal with. It's a lot to deal with. And just, I think, trying to process everything is a lot to deal with. But, and I tell moms now who may be going through something similar, like through support groups or whatever, no matter how you feel like you're in the thick of it and you're never going to come out of it, there is always light at the end of the tunnel. There is always hope. Like, those NICU doctors and nurses, they love your kids just as much as you love them. And they were an amazing support system through the whole thing as well. But just knowing, like, even how it may take a while to get to that going home day, but you will get there. And it's not always easy going home either, because you then have all these appointments, these specialist appointments, these therapies. I would joke and I say it was my full-time job to take my daughter to our children's hospital every week. But like, just making sure you can plan those out, that's best going to fit your schedule. Because it does get very overwhelming when you come home.
Hi, baby Charlie. Hi, honey.
Because it's like all of a sudden you had all of these doctors and nurses caring for your baby, and then they're like, here, you get to take your baby home, and you're like, but you're not going home with me. So it's like, okay, are you sure I can take care of this kid when I get home? But they do an amazing job, like, preparing you for going home, and just having that support system for when you get home, I think, is one of the biggest things that really helped me.